All right, I think we can get started. It's a few minutes later than usual, but Mass is a little bit longer than usual on the feast day of the Assumption too. So one of the things that a lot of people have been wondering is why I have so many questions for this, and part of it is that I think this is going to take us at least 2 weeks to get through all of this, so you need something to do next week. What?
You've already put a week in.
I know. So your answer should be like 3 times as good. Because part of it too, one of the reasons that I think there's a goodness to asking some questions is that, like usual, this isn't a very good angle for the video. I have to fix that. It's good to think about that's a little better. It's good to think about the text of the scriptures and to think about it, to try and really let it sink in. It's an easy passage. These are easy times to read them as if they're ancient history, as if it's about the life of St. Paul thousands of years ago. And in many ways it is. But there's a lot of stuff that applies to our own lives. And I think it's also good to try and allow things to be expansive. You know, sometimes I suspect you guys think I have lots of answers about Bible study and how this works and what it's talking about. And I would propose to you that this is just the beginning. I mean, there's all kinds of directions you can take the Bible and apply it. And I think that's important. We very easily end up thinking like, this text is hard, I don't really understand it, I'm going to wait until later, I'm going to wait until Bible study, I'm going to wait until Father explains it. And it's better to say, what do I understand now? What are some pieces that I can start putting into place and build things around? Because I face the same kinds of questions. It's like, I'm reading along and I'm like, shoot, where are all these places? So I went and found a map because it was like, I need a map. I don't know the location of Mytilene or Lesbos offhand, and Greek islands and all sorts of other things. I don't live in the Mediterranean world. Sometimes I wish I did, but most of the time I don't. It's kind of warm there. And they have to eat lots of fish. I'm not a big fish eater. I wouldn't mind the tomatoes and the cucumbers and the vegetables and stuff, but fish a couple times a day every day would get old real quick. But I think that it is important, or I would encourage you to try and let it be expansive. You don't want to say, this is what it means. This is the answer. In some ways, I feel bad because it's really easy, for instance, when you're teaching in school, for the students to want the answers to the exam. What is the answer to the question? And as a teacher, the far more critical skill that you're trying to lead them into is not what the answer is, because lots of answers can be found. That part isn't hard. It's how to think. And the desire to go look for the answer, because it's there quite often. And if we get into this mode of, I want the answer, so tell me what the answer is, and then we move on and we get to cross it off our list, in a way it's like missing the purpose. There's kids that do really well on exams and get terrified in their first job. What if you die and you're on the way to heaven and Peter says, oh, Father Keller's questions were good. We're going to take a few of them and see what you know. You'll be like, yeah, but I don't know. And then Peter can say to you, he was trying to teach you to think about it. Remember, he told you. So we're shortly after the events of the last chapter. Where did we end? At the end of chapter 19, what's the big event? It involves Demetrius. You remember his name. The riot of the silversmiths. They were these idol makers. There's a riot. They end up grabbing a bunch of people. They go to the... Where do they go? Where do they riot? Nope. Nope. The theater, the amphitheater. So they're in the amphitheater, they're kind of rioting. It tells a story of some people not even really knowing why they're there. The town official comes and quiets them down. That is basically like, if you guys don't behave, the Romans will come and kill you all. And then we have this introduction to chapter 20. So at the beginning of chapter 20, Paul gathers a few people together and he speaks to them and then he leaves. This is one of the instances where it seems like he's really working on this gift of prudence, or it's talking about prudence. It talks about him leaving for Macedonia. Now, Macedonia is the region of northern Greece. Macedonia is relatively rocky. I think there's some good olive oil that comes from there. And the cities that it includes are like Philippi, Berea, Thessalonica, and Amphipolis. Those were some of the cities that Paul had visited before on his journeys. So he's going back to some of these cities. And it's kind of odd because most of those cities he was chased out of by a group of Jews. I think, did it start in Philippi or Thessalonica? In one of them, he was at the synagogue. The Jews don't like him. They chase him out, and then they follow him to all these other towns and say, you have to get rid of this guy. He's not good. Paul has a strong pastoral concern for the churches that he founded. This seems to be the time when he's at Ephesus that he writes 1st and 2nd Corinthians. We can't place exactly at what spot he writes all of his letters, but I think that's an important point because this is an adventure that Paul is on and he's a missionary, but this is also a time of the writing of the New Testament. We're in the 50s and 60s after Christ, so these letters are being sent. And if you got a letter from Paul in Corinth, what do you think you did with it? I'll give you a hint. You probably didn't lock it in a box and hide it in the ground. You probably shared it with other synagogues. And so that means that very, very quickly, what did they start doing?
Writing it down?
Writing it down and making copies. They start making copies. What are copies made out of at this time? That's a good question. See all these things that you didn't even think of? We're not even done with the first page. We already have dozens of them. At this time, I don't know, this would be an interesting thing in the ancient Roman world because a lot of the scrolls and letters were written on papyrus. That comes from Egypt. It's a kind of reed that grows along the Nile, a bit like a cattail. And they would gather it together and they'd pound them and bake it in the sun, and it changes and becomes like a paper. By the time you get to the Middle Ages, for sure, and I don't know if it stretches back this far, this is one of the interesting points too, is that nice documents were written on animal skins that were stretched. So when they slaughtered an animal, the skin would be saved, and they had some processes to get some extra fur off, but they would stretch them out until they were thin, and they'd scrape the backside of them, and eventually when it gets thin enough, it can be used as a kind of paper. The degree that I got from the Angelicum in Rome, that was part of the seminary program that I was at, I got a degree from a Roman university too, is written on sheepskin. So Half of it, like the one side that it's written on is smooth and the other side is kind of furry. You can feel it. It's all in Latin, so it's kind of funny because it sounds really fancy and it mostly means that I got a degree. But
Did you frame it?
it's not framed yet. I actually need to frame all of my college degrees. I haven't done that. But it's important to think about because like this is the origin of the Christian Bible. And I was just watching something a few days ago about like the reliability of the scriptures. And one of the things is that the New Testament is the most reliable book in the world. That came out of the ancient world. There's something like 80,000 copies and fragments of it. And they almost all agree in their major points, unless someone missed something. Sometimes a few words get changed here or there. Sometimes scribes make errors where they like skip a page or a paragraph because one ends, and it ends with like the same word that something else begins with, and everything in the middle gets skipped. As one person noted, ancient scribes in many cases weren't all that much better than elementary students copying something today and make similar kinds of errors. You should know that in the ancient text, there's no capital letters. There's no periods, there's no punctuation. It's all the same text, and they don't even put spaces between words. So you really got to know what you're doing to read it, because you have to know how the endings work, you have to know where words end, and all these things. So it's kind of funny because even if you pick up like a Greek New Testament today, the standard scholarly one is called the Nestle-Aland Greek New Testament. It has periods, it has all these accents that people have figured out over the years, like where thoughts end and where they begin and that kind of thing. But the ancient text doesn't have that. Most of that comes into one of the great inventions of the Western world is attributed to the Carolingian Renaissance. It was called, no, you're 700 years too early. Carolingian Renaissance is in about 800. They invent what's called Carolingian minuscule, which is the first time that you have the distinction between capital letters and small letters. That comes about in around the year 800.
What were they writing with?
That's a great question. What were they writing with? That I don't know at all. They use ink. Black was the most common because I think you can make it out of charcoal. Like if you add some water to charcoal, you can turn it into a thick black paste. And they probably use stuff like squid ink, now that I think about it too. I mean, it's likely that they would mix several things together to make ink. But what they used for quills, that's a good question. I wonder if it was the end of some reeds, or if it was, they could have used feathers. I mean, feathers were very common, and we know that they had birds, but that would be a good question. I don't know.
If I remember correctly, the origins of like calligraphy and that kind of thing, they did use quills so that some of that ink could draw up into the opening of the quill.
Yeah.
You didn't have to keep dipping it quite as often.
Yes.
You could get the fluidity of.
So part of the reason that they used feathers is that they're hollow on the bottom, where it like sticks to the bird's skin. And I think they would even hollow out some of them so that some ink would draw up into the quill and you didn't have to dab it quite so often. Can you imagine trying to write with ancient pens and having to worry about like ink drops? If you've ever done it today, it is kind of fun. If you've never done it, find someone that has an inkwell and a quill. Today they're often made out of metal, but it's a different way to write and it takes some skill.
I can share.
I have some too. I've actually written some. Before I was ordained, I wrote members of my family a bunch of letters like that with quills and an inkwell. You have to use a paper that's textured though, Like flat plain paper like this doesn't work very well. You need like a parchment finish or a linen finish or something on it. It's got to have some texture or it just doesn't write very well. But it's important to see because like this is a time of the writing of the New Testament, and from the very beginning the letters of Paul and Christians were concerned about preserving these things. They inherited that from the Jews. Remember, the Jewish people in their synagogues would make copies of the scriptures and they would move them from one synagogue to the next. They would make, as soon as a synagogue was big enough, they'd start working on a Torah scroll. And that's the same even today. I think lots of them are still made by hand. And it's really, really fascinating to look at the care and concern that goes into this. Like there's a group of Jews in the Middle Ages that are known as the Masoretes. The Masoretic text is the oldest contiguous Jewish text that we have. It dates from the 900s. The New Testament is actually older as far as the document tradition goes than most of the Old Testament. Except for a few things, we found some at Qumran from the Essene community there that are older, but the Masoretic text is older. But the Masoretes knew exactly how many characters were in every single line of the Bible, and they would count it. They knew how many of each character was in it. They knew like exactly, they had a method and a rhythm and an understanding so that like even the person who wrote it, someone else would check it. They'd count the number of characters in the line. And if it wasn't right, they'd scrap it and start over. And it's important to know stuff like that because like there was a concern to preserve the text, that this is the Word of God. And it deserves more than just ordinary reverence. This isn't like a letter that you wrote to your aunt, and so if you spell a word wrong, you just cross it out and, scribble over it or whatever. Like, this is the Word of God. It's something to take care of. And so it's not just that there's all kinds of manuscripts of it, it's that they were practically insane about trying to keep the text exactly the way it was. And if you think about that, play the game of telephone sometime, where we start a story with Ed, and by the time it gets to Bev, it's changed completely, and then to Lawrence, and it's talking about frogs on Mars. But it's important to see, like, they have a concern for the text that is pretty dramatic. And it's being written at this time. Like, this is the era of the New Testament, and the church is already existing. Like, the church is already there. The church that Paul is writing to already meets in Corinth or in Ephesus or those kind of places. So he stays in Greece, he stays in Athens and Corinth for about 3 months. And then another plot is made against him. And so he decides to return to Macedonia by way of the sea. He sails there instead of going across land. Later, he will choose not to sail. And I kind of wonder, Paul relates in one of his letters that he gets shipwrecked 3 times, and one day he's left clinging to floating like debris from the boat for an entire day on the ocean. And he talks about that in one of his letters. And so it seems like he gets a little gun-shy about sailing for a while, because he sends some friends of his ahead on the boat, and he goes by land. Being shipwrecked the first time wasn't so bad, and the second time I started to wonder, and the third time it was like, no more. But there is a prudence at work, and this is a good virtue to spend some time with. Prudence is the virtue of doing the right thing at the right time in the right situation. But it's not a definite thing. Like, you can't say this is always prudent and this is always imprudent. If you think about the life of Jesus, was it prudent for him to confront the Pharisees at the end of his life? It meant his death, but one would argue, I hope we would argue, that it was the will of God. that there is a time to flee and there is a time where you have to confront things. As parents, you had to work on this too with your kids all the time. You had to learn the art of when do you plant a flag on the hill and die on it? When do you decide that they're just tired and it's not going to work anyway? You know, when do you just sort of roll your eyes and like, well, I tried? And there's a prudence to it. There's a wisdom to it. And you can't say in every situation, some of you probably had husbands and it's like, okay, just tell me what you want me to do. When do I discipline the kid? It's like, well, it's not like that. You have to think about, have they had enough to eat? Did they sleep last night? Are they sick? You know, because if some of those things are in there and you discipline the kid hard, is it going to work? No. Sometimes when they're 2, they just get to a point where it's like, okay, you're tired and you're mad at the world and nothing will help. It's not about what you want to eat. It's not about where you want to sit. It's not about what you're doing. You're just mad. And there's no way to solve it except to put them to bed. Like, that's it. That's the only solution to the problem. You can try feeding them and they'll eat like 2 of them and then throw it in your face. And you could say, go play, and they'll run around for a little bit and then they'll crash into the wall and thrash on the floor. And that's what they do. And prudence is like, okay, the only answer is we're putting pajamas on. Like, we're going to watch a movie. We're going to read a book. You just close your eyes and be there. Pretty soon, boom, sleep for like the next 16 hours and you're like, they were tired. Right? But there's a prudence to it. Like, this is what it means, that it's kind of an art. It's an ability to see what is right in a situation. And it's a hard virtue to master. In the Middle Ages, the scholastic tradition, like St. Thomas Aquinas, will talk about prudence as the mother of all virtues. Mother Prudence. Because if you don't have prudence, it can lead to a lot of things going backwards. Doing the right thing in the wrong situation doesn't work very well. Some of you learn this the hard way when you cook, that there's a few ingredients it doesn't matter for, and there's other things that if you don't add it in the beginning of the recipe when it tells you to, you're out of luck. It doesn't matter what you do to try and fix it, it's never going to work. There's just ingredients that are like that. Some things you're like, oh, I forgot this, I'll just add it in now. And other things it's like, well, you know. If you don't believe me, sometime add raw carrots to the end of your stir fry. And you'll have all these nice fried things, and then you'll have carrots and they'll crunch and it won't work in your brain very well. So there's a wisdom to this, and it's a hard virtue to master. It's something that we have to look at. But it's important here in the life of St. Paul, because Paul very often is kind of a firebrand and wants to jump in the middle and confront people. He wants to knock them on their butt and show them who's boss and show them that Jesus is Christ and Lord and Messiah. And you start to see that it's not the right answer in every situation. That his tendency to jump into the middle of something isn't always good. And so for him, prudence is backing off. Some of you feel very timid, and your tendency is in the other direction. We don't want to confront things. We don't want to jump in the middle. We don't want to have the difficult conversations, so we don't have them at all. That would be imprudent. Prudence says that there are times where you need to have conversations. There are times where you need to confront things. And so if your tendency is not to do it at all, then prudence probably pushes you to do it more often. If your tendency is to do it all the time, then prudence would say you should back off. And this is true of big things, and it's also just true of little things. There's sometimes where people who are married or living in a house with someone, you could get mad every time something gets forgotten, like the dishes don't get done, or shoes get left in the middle of the floor, or that corner in the kitchen got missed when your husband was sweeping. Sometimes you should ask, is it worth it? Because lots of you could just about write out how the conversation's going to go and tape it to the refrigerator and just point at it. You missed the corner again. Oh, I did? Yes, I see it every time you sweep. And it's like a script that plays out again and again. Prudence might say, maybe you should talk to him while he's sweeping. Like, would you get the corner while you're over there? It's an important virtue. And it's important for the spiritual life too. Like sometimes you go to pray and you really are falling asleep and can't stay awake. Is it a good time to I'm going to deeply pray and meditate with my eyes closed? No, you'll be out before you blink. Sometimes you just have to know, that's prudence. That's part of this wisdom. Sometimes we're lazy and sometimes we have lots of other things on our mind and we have lots of things we'd rather be doing. And then prudence is the virtue that says, maybe that should wait. Maybe it doesn't all need to be done right now. So this is something that Paul seems to be working on or living in the midst of it. And we have to be careful because we can easily be swayed by emotions and passions. We can be easily swayed by fears and anxieties and things that we have in our minds. That very much happens. Swayed by anger, frustration, annoyance, all of that. Okay, so we get Paul to Macedonia, and then he wants to go to Troas. Where is Troas? Troas is an island west of Mysia. And Adramyttium, I don't even know how to say that one. That's quite a name. We'll put that on the test next week. Adramyttium. Adramyttium. So Troas is over there. It's an island. And now it gives a list of names of people that are working with Paul. What is strange about this list of names? We've encountered this before in the Bible, and it's kind of odd. We've never heard about them. Who are they? Paul talks about all these coworkers, and he's like, okay, I'm sending you on ahead of me. But they've never been in the story so far. Did God create some new people from heaven and they come down in this cloud of light and bang, Paul has these coworkers? No, I don't know how people who get stuck in the literal sense of the Bible deal with some of these things, because it's yeah, but they haven't been there. And that it says that Paul is sending them out as missionaries. These can't be people that he just met yesterday. They don't know enough.
Maybe they were tent makers like he was.
They could be. They seem to be people that he had encountered at various places in his ministry, and he ended up bringing them with him. So Sopater was from Berea, which is a city in Macedonia. That was west of Philippi and Thessalonica. Aristarchus and Secundus are from Thessalonica. Gaius is from Derbe. And Timothy, the one that Paul writes a letter to, seems to have been from that same region. Derbe, Pisidian Antioch, Lydia, Iconium. Those cities were all next to each other in that region. That was the first place that Paul went on his missionary journeys. Tychicus and Trophimus are from Asia, which probably means from Ephesus. That's another one where it's a little bit like they're using these nouns collectively in the same way that we do. To say, I'm from North Dakota. Often in this region, people will say that, but they kind of mean Fargo. Or they mean close to here. Some of us don't. Some of us are from smaller towns and that kind of thing. But there is that kind of, it's not always clear, but it seems to be the region of Asia that these two are from is probably Ephesus. It could be outside of Ephesus. It could be in the farmland. It could be somewhere like that. But it's likely along those lines. Paul is mentioning these people. They all seem to be men at this point, But this is an interesting part, because if you remember when he goes to a lot of these places for the first time, it notes a number of women who listen to him. And so there's kind of a nice balance. Like the women came along first, the men are coming along second, but now some of the men are becoming co-workers or disciples of Paul, and he's sending them out, like Jesus sends out apostles. They're probably people that respond most enthusiastically to the message of Paul. So they're people that are hearing him preach, they are moved, they are excited, and they want to learn more. They're the kind of people who have encountered God in this life of St. Paul. Those are the kinds of people that often end up leading a mission or leading an area or a group. The people that are willing to hear the word and take it in and act on it. Like, this means something. That's something that we've started talking a lot more about at Holy Spirit, and something, like I said, this chapter is a good one because you can see that Paul is recognizing he can't do it all himself. The mission is too big. There's too many people to reach. There's not enough Pauls to go around. And cutting himself in half doesn't work very well. So there's this sense that the ministry has to be entrusted to others. That there's other people that have to join him or it's never going to work. And this is exactly what it means when we start talking about discipleship or taking up a mission ourselves. That priests in our parishes can't do it all. That religious and nuns and the people that are in, or the people that have this vocation, there's too much work to do. There's too many places to go. There's too many people that need an encounter with grace. That's part of why God is calling you here and now. And that's part of learning this place that fits with a mission. You can see it very much in the life of Paul. He started a lot of these churches, but now he's entrusting them to the hands of another. Paul also knows he's not going to be around forever. He seems to have this sense, like there's almost this thing where he's been busy and he's been moving from place to place, and he's been visiting a lot of people and imparting important messages to them and writing important messages to them. That's the kind of thing that people do when they feel like they have a bit of a storm cloud hanging over their head. And it's amazing how often, if you look back at people's lives, especially people who have recently died, that there's times where you see these odd things happen. I remember one of my great uncles in particular, he ended up dying from a heart attack. He was on a treadmill. He was in his 80s, I think, and relatively healthy, and just keeled over dead one day. The doctor thinks he was dead before he actually hit the ground. Like that it was just massive.